Okay. All right, so thanks for coming out tonight. As you guys know, Lab 1 was due last night at 11:59 p.m. If you have not submitted it, you can still do so. You will just lose 10% per day. I believe that is in the syllabus. If not, it'll either say 20% or 10%. We're going with 10% just because it's a little bit easier. Also today we're going to be assigning Lab 2. We're going to be doing kind of like an intro to working with Express rather than just kind of a JavaScript refresher. Today's slides, there's about 40 slides that I'm going to be going over. If this is just review for you, if you kind of already have a firm grasp of JavaScript, feel free to just tune out for the first half an hour. But we're going to be going over kind of things that are the building blocks of working with JavaScript. We're going to be going over some different functions with arrays, working with strings, how to concat strings together, just kind of like small nitty-gritty stuff that comes with JavaScript, and you will actually see why I'm going over this with the lab that we'll be assigning today. So with that being said, does anyone have any questions? It's usually good to ask before we start. No questions? Not even with the Vlad?
Can you put slides on the blackboard?
Sorry?
Can you put the slides on the blackboard? Or?
I can. Do you want me to do that right now?
No, right now.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, I can put that up. Is there a way to like dim the lights up here? I don't think so. Thank you. Okay. So a JavaScript statement has a syntax that's similar to Java, as well as C# and other programming languages that you guys have worked with before. White space refers to any sort of like tab, spaces, or characters and return characters in code that's ignored by the compiler. So anything that is not registered by the compiler is considered white space and is ignored in your application. As a result, you can use spaces, tabs, or return characters to format your code so that way it's easier to read. Because the main thing when it comes to writing code is, although these are instructions that the computer is able to process, if we put it all on one line, the computer can read it just as fine. Whereas we want to try to make our code readable, especially when we go out into the workplace, because we're not going to be the only ones that are working with our code. Typically we work in teams. You'll be acquiring other people's code. Other people will be acquiring your code. So the main thing of being able to use white space is try to make it more human readable. That's why when we are working with a function, we tab all of that content inside of it so that way just visually looking at it, you can already tell that all of that code is in that function rather than it just being all tabbed all to the left. In some cases, JavaScript will try to correct what it thinks is a missing semicolon by adding a semicolon at the end of a line. So in JavaScript, semicolons are optional, which is why it does this. It's usually always best practice to always put in a semicolon, but there's a couple cases where even though that you put in a semicolon, it will still try to put it in. And in a couple slides, I will go over that. But as you guys know, that's how you program JavaScript. The basic syntax rules is that JavaScript is case sensitive, so you can have two different variables with different capitalization, and you can use both of them. As well as, you know, if you type something that's all uppercase, as more like that's the usual syntax for a constant, whereas if you did something that's either Pascal case or camel case, they are two different things. So it's case sensitive, it ignores extra white space within statements, and each JavaScript statement ends with a semicolon. Or if it doesn't, then the compiler will automatically put that in. So how to split a statement over two or more lines, there's a couple different ways. Any sort of arithmetic or relational operator allows you to do that, so any sort of math operations that you're using. An opening brace or bracket or parentheses allows you to put code onto the next line, as well as a closing brace. And as you guys also saw in week 1, you can use the backtick operator when you're, or not operator, the backtick for strings. So that way you can write a string that's across multiple lines is also valid. What doesn't split across is an identifier, a value, or the return keyword. So if you end up typing return, this is what I was mentioning just a second ago with the semicolons. If you wanted to return an object from a function and you type in return and then on the next line you start shaping your object, it will automatically put in that semicolon right after return and it will end up returning undefined. So it won't return anything at all. So it's sometimes a little bug that if you don't necessarily understand how JavaScript works, you can kind of get into it. But once you kind of get experience with the language, it kind of becomes second nature. And there's a lot of tooling that will help you kind of catch that stuff before. As well as a closing brace or a parentheses does not split a statement after. So identifiers are names given to variables, functions, objects, properties, and methods. Mostly when you do these, you can use var, let, or const to declare them, as well as there's also, you can just declare a named function. In camel casing, all the words within an identifier except for the first word starts with a capital letter. So if you have something that makes up 3 words in a regular sentence, you just push them all together, capitalize the second and continued words. Rules for creating identifiers is that an identifier can contain letters, numbers, the underscore, and $sign. Identifiers cannot start with a number, but once you start with anything else, then a number is fair game. As mentioned, they're case sensitive. Identifiers can be any length, although try to keep it, like, don't make it too short that it's not helpful, but don't make a 1,000-character long variable name because you'll have to constantly type that. So identifiers can't be the same as reserved keywords, which I will be going over in a couple slides of different reserved keywords. And you should also avoid using global properties and methods as identifiers, as if you use them, you won't be able to use the global property or method with the same name. So here's an example of some identifiers. So these could all just be variable names, subtotal, tax rate, index, calculate, click, and log. All of those are valid. At the bottom is a difference between camel casing and underscore notation. So tax rate, rate is capitalized with a R, whereas tax rate on the right is like snake case or underscore case, however you want to refer to it, as separated with an underscore. So usually I recommend to always use camel case in JavaScript. Different programming languages usually have different preferences. It's neither right nor wrong, but the main thing is just to be consistent. So if you're going to use camel casing, stick with it, or underscore, stick with it, but don't mix back and forth because it can make just working in your program, it doesn't make it as, it makes it a lot easier to read if it's all in the same format. Likewise, as mentioned before, try to use meaningful names for your identifiers. This way you can know just by looking at it what it is. In the case of the previous example with tax rate, you know that that is going to be the rate for tax. And especially in the context of your application, you'll know what that tax rate is referring to. Whereas if you just had a variable called tax or TX rate or something like that, it might not necessarily be as easy to know right at looking at the code what that variable is representing. So if you're using underscore notation, you also want to use lowercase for everything, so there's no capital letters in your underscores. Here is a table of like different reserved keywords. There's a fair bit, and some of these might not actually be for just JavaScript, but most programming languages, especially ones that have originated from the C programming language, have a lot of similar reserve words. So you'll see in here const, which is how we can declare a constant variable inside of JavaScript. Obviously, you can't have a variable called const because that would be a little bit confusing. As well as some other stuff, class, catch, try, if. All of these are different things that when the compiler is compiling our code, it knows that it's supposed to do certain things with those reserved keywords. So that's why you cannot use them. How to use object methods and properties. An object has methods that perform functions that are related to the object, as well as properties that represent the data or attributes that are associated with the object. So in this case, if going more with object-oriented programming, you guys probably have a lot more experience with Java. If I had a class that had methods, usually those methods are functions that you can call relative to that class. Whereas a property would be something like in the case of, say I have a person object that has a first name and a last name, and those are going to be properties. It kind of describes what that person is. Whereas I might have a nice helper function called full name, which would return me both the first name and the last name concatenated together. So that would be a method that is relative to the object, whereas the properties are just kind of, you can think of it as, I don't know, just values of that. So when you call a method, you may need to pass one or more parameters to it by coding them within the parentheses after the method name, separated by commas. You guys have been programming for a while. You guys probably know how to call a function by now. The window object is the global object for JavaScript, and JavaScript lets you omit the object parameter, actually just refer to it without window. And the syntax for calling a method of an object, you would have the object name, the method name, and then the parameters as you call it. So primitive data types, every programming language has primitive data types. The big ones are going to be number, Boolean. String isn't necessarily a primitive data type, but I do have it in here. Just kind of makes it a little bit easier if you just treat it as one. But a number type in JavaScript is any sort of integer or decimal value. There's no difference in JavaScript between a decimal number or an integer when you declare it. It doesn't really matter. As well as it can be positive or negative. An integer is a whole number, meaning that there's no decimal points, and a decimal value has decimal points. If a result is stored in a number data type that is larger or smaller than the data type can store, it will be stored as the value of infinity or negative infinity, depending if it's negative or not. A Boolean data type, as you guys know, is true or false. You can represent many things as a Boolean. But it's just true or false. That's it. Floating point numbers. In JavaScript, decimal values are stored as floating point numbers. In that format, a number consists of a positive or negative sign, one or more significant digits, an optional decimal point, optional decimal digits, and an optional exponent. So this is more when you're working with like large numbers, you know, working with like constants of, say, the speed of light. Usually you don't write out the full thing. Usually you have some sort of representation of what that number represents. So unless if you're developing an application that requires the use of very large or very tiny numbers, you won't have to use floating point numbers to express them. Chances are we're not going to, well, I know we're not going to cover that in this class. It's kind of, again, that's working with very large numbers that you can't, once you have too many digits, it starts to get unreadable. But we're not going to be working with that. So a string is a data type that represents characters, a sequence of characters. In other programming languages, a string is just an array of characters that you can reference. You can create a string just by using double or single quotes as well as the backtick. Whatever you start a string with, you also have to end a string with. So if you start with a single quote, you have to end it with a single quote, and so on. An empty string is just a string that contains no characters. It can be entered by typing 2 quotation marks with nothing in between them. Fairly straightforward stuff. Is anyone confused by that thus far? No, cool. So how to code numeric expressions. To code a numeric expression, you can use arithmetic operators to operate on 2 or more values. A modulus operator returns the remainder of a division operation. A arithmetic expression is evaluated based on the order of precedence. So for those of you that hopefully remember high school math is BEDMAS, so it's same rules apply. To override the order of precedence, you can use parentheses, just because brackets are first done, same thing as BEDMAS. Because the use of increment and decrement operators can be confusing, the recommendation is that you only use these operators in expressions that consist of just a variable name followed by the operator. So as you guys know, you can do the plus plus operator to increment as well as the minus minus to decrement. It's totally valid to use that in a statement. So you could do x equals y plus I plus plus. So that's totally valid to do, but is kind of confusing when you first look at it. It's usually better if you want to increment something to do that first, and then you can do the arithmetic after. So as you guys know, addition, subtraction, multiplication, division. We all know how that works. I certainly hope so by this point. Our lab today is going to be creating just a simple calculator that's going to be going over addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division using Express. So it's good just to cover this. How to work with a numeric variable. A variable stores a value that can change as the program executes. To declare a variable, you use the var, let, or const keyword followed by your variable name and then the number. Within an expression, a numeric literal is a valid integer or decimal number that isn't enclosed in quotation marks. To assign a value to a variable, you can use the assignment statement. Again, this is mostly review. I'm just going to skip it and just show you the examples. So the first one is where we declare just one variable in JavaScript using the var keyword, but we have not assigned it any sort of value. The second one after that is declaring 3 variables all at the same time without assigning them any values. Then we can give it a number, we can do a calculation and give that to, and then at the bottom is where we're doing our incrementing. So we can create a counter with 1. We can say counter equals our current value of counter plus 1. We can do a plus equals, which is a shorthand, and then we also have an even shorter of just incrementing just 1 with plus plus. So nothing too groundbreaking. Working with strings and Boolean variables. Strings you can concat together using the plus operator. Just like you were to add 2 numbers together, you can use a plus to concat 2 strings together. There's also, inside of strings, you can use escape sequences, which I will go over in just the next slide, which allow you to do stuff like new lines. You can do a double quote or a single quote if you're using a string. As you know, using a single quote or double quote will close the string. But we can use the escape sequence to being able to put these special characters inside of our code. Also, if you use a plus sign in an expression, both values are strings, JavaScript will concat them. JavaScript does some pretty weird stuff where it will try to assume things for you, thinking that it's smarter than you. So in some cases, if you have a number value, let's say you have the number 5, and then you actually have the string of 5 outside. And if you try to add them together, sometimes it will automatically convert that string into a number for you. So you sometimes will get 10, whereas in other cases, if you try to work with it, if you have 2 strings that are 5 and 5 as a string, and you can cat them together, you'll actually get 55 instead of getting 10. So you always want to make sure in JavaScript, because it's a dynamically typed language, a variable can be a number then a string the next moment. You always want to make sure that your types are what you're expecting them to be. So if you're trying to do math, make sure that they're a number. Otherwise, you're going to get some kind of unexpected results. So common escape sequences, as mentioned, you can do a backtick n for a new line, single quote, double quote, backspace, null character, horizontal tab. Because we use the backslash in order to escape, if we wanted to actually put in a backslash, we have to do it twice, so that way we can escape it and say that we want to put that character into our string. When we're wanting to take a string value of a number and we want to convert it into a number, we use parseInt and parseFloat. The window object provides both parseInt and float, so that way you can convert the string values. When you use the prompt method on a text box or really any sort of input, everything comes back as a string. So if you had a form where you enter in some sort of numeric value and then you do a post, it will, well, sorry, not with a post, with a get, it will always be a string value. So you have to either parseInt it or parseFloat it, depending if it's a decimal number or not. Speaking with not a number, if a value is not a number, it gets turned into NaN, standing for not a number, which just means that when you've used parse int and parse float, it's not been able to convert it into a regular number, so it will convert it to that. When working with methods, you can embed one method in a parameter of another. This is sometimes referred to as object chaining. So if anyone has worked with jQuery before, you know that you can chain stuff continually, which when working with stuff more like with arrays in a more functional programming language, you'll do that a little bit more, but in most cases we probably won't be chaining stuff. We'll just do something else on the next line. Conditional expressions, this is where we are able to take two values and then convert it into an expression that is a Boolean. So we can do an equal check, we can say not equal, less than equal, greater than equal. One thing that is not in this chart is JavaScript has the ability to have a triple equal. Does anyone here know what a triple equal versus a double equal does?
That checks for the same type.
Correct. So in this case, if I had, as mentioned before, if I had a string that's the value of 5, and I actually had the number 5, and I wanted to just do a double equals, it does type conversion to try to make it the same type. And in that case, that would end up being true. However, if I use a triple equal, it also checks its type, and it'll say, you know, 5 is equal to 5, yes. But one of these is a string and one of these is a number, so it is not true. So sometimes if you feel that, you know, you're not getting the right result, make sure that I almost always use triple equals. It can be a little bit heavier of a process because you're comparing the types, but it will usually prevent a lot of bugs. So I just recommend using triple equals. How the logical operators work is you have not, and, or. I'm sure in your math class you guys went over or gates and and gates and all that sort of fun stuff. Not as fun, but this is how you can end up chaining multiple Boolean expressions if you're doing like an if statement or some sort of, in JavaScript we have some fun stuff that we can actually do with the and or operators. We can end up doing what is called short circuiting. But we'll get into that later. To override the order of precedence when two or more logical operators are used in a conditional expression, you can use parentheses similar to regular math. So if you have a and statement and you want two expressions that will either return true or false, and then you could do an or with something else. So how to code if statements, it's pretty small on the screen. But as you guys know, you have an if statement with some sort of condition with code inside of it. Then you can have as many else ifs as you want after. And then optionally, you can just use an else statement that covers everything else. How to code while and do loops. The difference between a while loop and a do loop is a do loop will always be executed at least one time and then checking the expression after the fact. Whereas a while loop will check that expression first and then execute the code inside of it as long as that condition is still true. So in some cases, it makes perfect sense to use a do while loop. In other cases, not so much. For loops are a little bit different. They're done numerically, so you will end up creating some sort of counter. You will have a condition of, say, I is less than 10, and then you usually increment that counter, and then the code inside of it that you want. So if you're dealing with an array of values, it doesn't necessarily make sense to use a while or do while loop, but if you're looping over values in an array, you can say while I is less than the number or the array.length, then I want to execute this code at that index. So working with objects, functions, and events, there are a bunch of different objects that you can create in JavaScript. A lot of them are built into the language, such as like the date. Here's just a couple functions that are for it. As I believe I mentioned in the last class, a good resource for being able to look at JavaScript documentation is MDN. So if you're wanting to work with a date object, you can just go to their site and see a full list of all their methods. And then also here's some just below that for a string. So obviously different methods will call different we'll use different code. For example, here is us creating a date, and then we can use toDate string, which will be a human readable string value. You can use full year just to get the year, etc. And then down below is just for a string, you can convert it all to uppercase, get the length of the string, index of, so you can give a string value and see where does that index start for that value that you gave it. All this, again, just kind of review for you guys. For creating and calling an anonymous function, so in JavaScript, you can have regular functions that are named, like in any language that you've used, as well as you can create anonymous functions. So a function is a block of code that can be called by other statements in the program. In this case, I'm just going to kind of skip over most of this. It works the exact same thing as a regular function, but in this case, you'll see that I have not named the function right here. Usually you would do like function variable name and then give it parameters, but in this case, we're actually creating an anonymous function and assigning that to a variable. So we would still execute it the exact same way. I usually prefer to do this just so that it's consistent. I create all my variables. I can create all my functions the exact same way. But neither is here nor there. Modern day, they pretty much had the exact same performance. So some examples. An anonymous function with no parameters. As you know, you don't have any parameters inside the parentheses. You can execute whatever code you want. And then as soon as this function is done, those variables don't exist anymore. As well as an anonymous function with one parameter, you can give it an ID, and it will return that element from the DOM, so you can return from it. And then lastly, an anonymous function with two parameters that returns a value. In this case, it's going to, it accepts a subtotal and tax rate, it multiplies them, it parse floats it because it converts it to a string with two values, and then just returns that. To create and call a named function is the exact same way. Instead of assigning it to a variable, you just give it the function name after the word function. Works the exact same. Doesn't matter. The only difference between these two functions is anyone familiar with the term hoisting when it comes to JavaScript? One person. So what hoisting is when you declare a variable or a function in JavaScript when you declare a variable using the var keyword, or you declare a function, it will automatically pull it to the top of what that scope is. So if it's in the global scope, it'll pull it to the top of that document. If it's in within another function, it'll pull it to the top of that function. And what ends up happening is you can actually use a function before it's been declared because of hoisting. However, when you assign it to a variable, the initialization of that variable is hoisted to the top. However, that variable does not know that it's actually assigned a function. So you will not actually be able to use that function until that block of code where it assigns it to the variable is used. It's always best practice. Basically, if you're wanting to use something, make sure that it's called before. Makes total sense to me. If it doesn't, we can talk later if you want. Yep.
Can you explain anonymous functions again?
Yes.
2 slides before.
Oh,
The one with the $.
This one right here?
Yeah.
So in JavaScript, the $sign is a perfectly valid character that you can create with a, to create a variable, $sign is totally valid. It doesn't have to start with a letter. It just can't start with a number. So in this case, they have created a variable called $sign, and they are assigning it the value of a function. So that function takes in an ID, and then it returns document get element by ID. So instead of creating a function, so you could do function $sign ID, instead we just end up assigning it to a variable. So it works the exact same way.
So is it safe to say this line is borrowed from jQuery library?
It's certainly similar. The reason why jQuery ended up using $sign is just because it's quick. The $sign was not really used at that point. And it just made it, they kind of just took ownership of it. So if you go into any sort of application, people didn't, or I was actually listening to a talk today The guy didn't know that the $sign was a perfectly valid variable name. He just thought that, where did this $sign come from? All of a sudden, everyone's using this $sign. And it's just because jQuery just assigned their jQuery suite to the variable of the $sign, and you can use it.
Just like lambda used to.
Exactly. Yeah. Like Lodash, they use the underscore. Doesn't really matter. It's just assigned to a variable.
Okay.
So, where was I? So, when and how to call the local and global variables. The scope of a variable or function determines what code has access to it. So this is where if it's not in any sort of function, if it's just loosey-goosey in your JS file, it's most likely going to be in the global scope. When you declare a variable using the var keyword inside of a function, when that function ends, it no longer exists. However, if you created it in, say you have a function and you have a for loop, if you declared a variable inside that for loop, it still exists when you're inside of that function. Whereas when we use the const and let keywords for declaring a variable, it is actually block scoped. So anything that we create in a for loop using the word const, as soon as we are outside of that for loop, it doesn't exist anymore. So there's a little bit of differences between declaring const and let versus var, but they're pretty much interchangeable in the case of let and var. Variables created outside of functions, as I mentioned, are global, whereas created inside are local. Any questions about that? Nope. So working with arrays, an array is the ability to have multiple elements of something just in one variable. Kind of think of it like a container. One way to create an array is we can use the new keyword followed by the object of array, as well as you can also just use square brackets. Both are totally valid. So right here, it's a little bit hard to see, but we have var array name equals new array, and we can give it a length, or we can use var array name equals and then square brackets. When we end up using new array and then giving it a length, if you say gave it a length of 10, that array would have 10 elements that are undefined because it doesn't know what to put in it. It just knows that it needs a length of 10 and it doesn't know what's inside of it. For being able to add and delete array elements, there's a couple different functions that you can use. One way to add an element is to use the length property. So if you end up changing the length of an array, it'll just make it undefined at that end. But most likely, that's not how we're going to interact with an array. If we're wanting to change an array, usually we have something that we want to put inside of it. So we would end up using push, which is a couple slides up from now, that allows us to push a new element into that array. But you can also delete, so you can delete a specific index from an array. Again, same thing, it just converts it to being undefined. Using for loops, as I mentioned, if you're wanting to iterate over an array, the old school way of doing it was creating a for loop based off of the length of the array, and then we just keep incrementing our index until it is less or no longer less than the numbers of length. And then we just refer to it based off of its index number, and that's it. Something else that's in the language, we can also use a for in loop, and what this does is instead of creating a element, instead of creating like a variable called I or index or something, what this does is it will loop over, it'll loop over our array and it will return us an index for every single one. So in this case, we can say for var element or element index in array, and we can just use that to refer to our index. It just makes it's like a little bit of a shorthand syntax. Again, I don't really use this. I can't remember the last time I used a for in loop. And just as with almost any other object that's in JavaScript, there's a bunch of functions: push, pop, unshift, shift, join, toString. These are how we can end up adding and removing elements from our array. The most important ones is probably pop, unshift, and shift. Or sorry, push, unshift, and shift. Pop, what it does is it just takes off the last element that is in our array. But there's also other ways that you can end up manipulating an array. So in this case, if we had an array called names with Mike, Ann, and Joel, and by the way, I promise this is the last slide, so you can just have a sigh of relief. If we had an array called names, we could end up pushing in multiple values into that array. Then we end up using pop, and like I said, that will take off the last value in our array, and then it just ends up joining them together to saying Mike, Ann, Joel, and Ray, with Tom being removed. The second one is declaring the exact same array, except we use unshift instead of push. And because we're using unshift, it will actually just insert it at the beginning of our array. So in this case, we put in Ray and Tom, so then it goes Ray, Tom, Mike, Ann, and Joel. We can also use shift, and this will take off the beginning element of our array. So you can think of it the same thing as pop, except instead of taking off the last element, it takes off the first element and shifts everything up one. And then same thing, it just joins them together. So you can see it says Tom, Mike, Ann, and Joel. And then lastly is just using join into string. So we have our array of 4 names. We can join them together, and by default, it will just put a comma and just join them all together. You can also give it a string value of what you want it to join together with. So in this case, it's just using a space, but you could use like a dash or a slash or really any sort of string value that you're wanting to join these 2 names together. And then also toString does pretty much the exact same thing, but we'll display it. It's similar to just using join with a comma. Any questions about that? No? Okay. So I'm going to go over Lab 2 and just kind of explain what we're doing for that. So you can find it under Submissions, Lab 2. What? Oh. Okay. So we're going to be creating a simple calculator for this lab. Again, this lab will be due Monday, next Monday, which unfortunately is a holiday, but it will still be due at 11:59. So try to have it done before then so you can enjoy your long weekend. How we're going to go about this lab is we end up creating our application called Lab 2. We're going to initialize npm and create the package JSON file via the wizard. We're going to install, I thought I changed this. It's supposed to say install express, not connect, through npm. We're going to modify package JSON to use nodemon to start the application. We'll create server.js. We're going to link to the express and the URL packages. If that's confusing, basically we're just going to be, when we use npm install with --save, that will connect our application to let it know to use those dependencies. When we're going to write a calculate function that parses the URL for 3 parameters, which is going to be method, x, and y. The possible values for the method parameter are add, subtract, multiply, and divide. If the method value is anything else, it's going to just show an error message. We're going to determine which math operation to run based on the value of the method parameter. We're then going to perform that math operation on the other 2 values of x and y, and then display the full math operation and its result on the page in this format. So x method y equals result. Any questions thus far about that? Okay. I have 4 sample URLs, so that way you can just copy paste them into your browser and be able to test that it says that it matches the same thing to make sure your application is working. And then down here it just says install npm and use the wizard to create your package file. Install the nodemon module so your application automatically restarts. The one thing, and I believe I went over it last class, is we're going to use nodemon so that way when we make a file change, it will detect it and restart our server. Otherwise, if you're just using node by itself, you will make a change and then it won't show up and you're like, did I do something wrong? You'll change your code, still nothing works, and you're like, why isn't this working? You need to just restart your server. So NodeMon will handle that for us automatically behind the scenes, which is pretty handy. To submit your lab, please create a repository on GitHub. You can then publish your files to that GitHub repository, and then you submit the GitHub link on Blackboard. I will not accept an assignment that is not through GitHub. GitHub is free. It's good to use. Is there anyone here who has never used GitHub before? Good. Okay. I'd be shocked if you guys got this far without using GitHub. Just sending zip files all the time to professors, that'd be awful. I know sometimes professors will require you to also submit a zip file of your code alongside your GitHub link. I don't care. Don't want it. I'm not going to use it. So I'm not going to waste your time. So just make sure it's on GitHub. As mentioned, if you submit on... So I'm actually going to change what I had said last week about labs. If you submit, the moment that you submit your lab on Blackboard, I will try to mark it as soon as possible. I started waiting now until the deadline of the lab is done, but I like to try to get you guys, obviously, your marks back as soon as possible. So if I mark it, give it back to you, and you're like, oh man, I forgot to do this, thanks for all the feedback, blah, blah, blah. If something's not working, please resubmit it. I allow every assignment to have the same mark from the previous one. So you can submit it as many times as you want, within reason. Please don't send like 20 submissions. But you will always automatically get the highest mark. So you don't have to worry about resubmitting it and your mark's lower. But yeah, I mean, like, if you just get it done, I can get you feedback hopefully as soon as possible, if that's what you're interested in. Yeah. Is there any questions? Yes.
Instead of creating a repo with that name, can we create a folder within a repo with the name you've specified?
Sure, if you want to do that.
I just don't have to create a new repo for every lab.
Yeah. You can just create like one repository for the class if that makes it easier to manage all of your stuff. That's totally valid. If anyone else wants to do that, that actually sounds like a good idea. The only thing that it gets a little bit more complex is if you're trying to like work across multiple assignments. When we get into the group assignments, I do recommend to use a different repository. Because otherwise you're just going to be giving your classmates, hopefully you trust who you're working with, but you'd be giving them full access to that entire repository. So maybe for the assignments, using a different one, just as a suggestion.
Sounds good.
Any other questions? No? Okay. So it's a little bit early, but I say we'll take a 15-minute break, and then when we come back, we can start actually doing some programming. I'm going to be doing the lab in class with you. So as long as you follow along, I please encourage you to not just copy my code and submit it, because that is plagiarism. I want you to use my code as a reference, but always try to do your best. Because I mean, like, honestly, I will try to help you as much as I can if you get stuck with something. Last semester, I wasn't necessarily as good about commenting my code for those of you that learn best from the comments, but I am trying to be a little bit more proactive with those comments. So if you feel that there is something that I write in class on the board and I don't comment it and you need help with it, just remind me to just yell out, because I'll probably be looking at my screen. So just yell at me to put a comment. Anyway, so 15 minutes, that'll be back here at 7 o'clock. Yep.
Are you going to go around and install NPM and Express or no?
NPM should automatically be installed with Node.
Okay.
So if you don't have Node installed, then you don't have NPM.
I do have Node.
Okay. So if you just type in npm space -v, that should display to you what your npm version is. If anyone does not have Node installed, please try to install it on this quick 15-minute break that we have. And if you have any questions, feel free to come up to the front. One second.
I have submitted my code, but
Okay, so we're gonna create our project for our lab. So if you open up your text editor, and we will create a folder for our project. So in this case, I always put mine under documents. This will be Tuesday's class. I actually need to just quickly clean this up because I just called Tuesday and just put all our stuff from day one in there. So lab 1. And if you just want to create a folder for your lab 2, why is it, okay. I'm just going to use the terminal. Give me 1 sec. Okay. So I have my lab 2 folder, and I'm just going to create a, well, actually the first thing that I do is I'm going to use npm init. So let me increase my terminal size so you can see it. Is that good for everyone that is in the back? You're able to see my terminal right here? So the first thing that we need to do to initialize our application is we type in npm init, and then we just hit enter. So in this case, it's saying that my package name is Tuesday. Oh, hold on. I have this in the wrong folder for myself. I want to be in lab 2. And now I can write npm init. So my package name is going to be lab 2. Version, you can just mostly hit enter through all of these. And then just hit enter. And it will now create our file. So you can see package.json is now here before the folder was empty. I'm also going to increase my font size so you can see it. Font size to 18. Lab 2, I had said server.js, so that's what I'm just going to call it. So server.js. And we can just leave that blank for now. The 2 modules that we need to install in our project is both Express and nodemon. So to install a module, you'll type in npm install into your terminal, followed by the name of the module that you want to install. So in this case, it's going to be Express, and then we type in /save. I'm going to bump this up some more so that way it's really easy to see. So we npm install Express, and then we use /save, and if I reopen package, you'll now see that I have a dependency for Express. Can I ask someone to turn off the lights for me? That'd be great. Should make it a little bit easier for people to see. Thank you. Is that too dark for anyone? All right, no one's scared of the dark? All right. So once we have our dependency of Express, the next thing that we have to do is install our dependency for nodemon. So inside of Node, there's a couple different dependencies that you can install. Nodemon is only going to be running on our machine. We don't need to push this up because it's only used as you're editing your files locally. When you deploy it to a server, you're not using nodemon because your files are not changing. So in this case, we will type in npm install, and then we'll say nodemon /save, and then before you hit enter, you want to type in -dev, so save dev. That means that it will be our development dependency. And every time that you install a different module, you'll see that sometimes the output in the terminal is going to be a little bit different. In this case, we end up getting some stuff with node pre-gib. We have some warnings, not a big deal. But now you can see that we have a dependency of Express and a dev dependency of nodemon. Just wait a little bit just for those of you who are doing it. Again, the two commands is npm install express space -- save, and then npm install nodemon -- save - dev. Is there anyone who's having issues installing from npm on their machine?
So the save, you said npm install nodemon.
Save - dev. It's at the very bottom. I can bring my terminal up so you can see it.
Thanks.
Okay. So, as I showed you guys last week in class, it's pretty easy to set up a node server. So the first thing that we need to do is we're going to create a variable called express, and this is where we require in express. So when we type in require and we don't do any sort of relative pathing, it knows by default to check our node modules folder. So we're going to install express, and then we're going to create a variable called app. And this is going to be where we initialize our express application, hence app. The other thing that we need to do is we're going to create a port, which is going to be 3000. By default, a lot of people, like most things for Node applications, will run on port 3000 locally. This is just a common port that most Node applications will run on, but you're welcome to change it to anything else. I know sometimes if you're using like XAMPP, that'll run on like port 8080. You can also do like port 8000. Doesn't really matter. I just always go with 3000 just because it's the most common. So I'll just throw some comments in. So port our application will run on init express and require in express. If you find yourself taking a little bit longer to write comments locally, just don't worry about it. Just remember that my code will be on GitHub. Once we get our server just running bare bones, then we will, I'll push up my code to GitHub so that way you can download it. So once we have app, we want to listen to the port that we created. So we'll type in app.listen, which is a function that we give not 3000 as a number, but just our variable port. And then lastly, I'm going to console log saying your application is running at HTTP localhost, and then I'm going to use our port variable as well in line with our string. So if for some reason we ever wanted to change, if we ever wanted to change our port from 3000 to something else, without having to change it in multiple places, we just change it once. So if I save this, the only other thing that we have to do to start up our server is we have to now run nodemon on our server. So if I type in nodemon server.js, this may or may not work for you. I have nodemon already installed globally on my machine, so I can use it anywhere. So I can just run it as a command. Whereas when we have it in we have scripts in our package JSON file, which I'll show you in a second, that you can kind of think as like shortcuts. So if you have something that you are typically reusing over and over again, most times on like a computer, you'll create a shortcut, throw it on your desktop or somewhere else so that it's easy to access. And scripts in package.json are kind of the exact same thing. So in this case, we don't actually, the only script that we have is test. We can just remove that. And just to let you know, I am in package.json right now, and I am just going to make it full screen just so it's easier. Ooh. There. And I'll bump that up a little bit. Okay. So inside of scripts, I'm going to create two. I'm going to have start, which is just going to be an empty string right now. And I'm going to have dev, which is also going to be an empty string. All right. So to run our application, we always run node, and we can run start with node server.js. And then for dev, which is going to be our dev server, we're going to run nodemon server.js. So they're exactly the same syntax, where you just have your command and then the file that you're wanting to run, and then same thing with start with node and server.js. So if I save that, just going to let those who are still copying it down to copy it down. I'll just throw it to the left-hand side. So now instead of running nodemon server.js, I can actually just type in npm run dev. And this will now automatically run our command of nodemon server.js. Some of these commands that we end up actually running through package.json can get quite lengthy. Sometimes you can have 100, 200 characters, and you don't want to have to type that every single time. So that's why we have these shortcuts to make our lives a little bit easier. So if I open up our browser and I go to localhost 3000, you'll see that we get an error. And this is actually a good sign, because if our application was not running, we would get nothing at all. So if I just kill the server, refresh, you'll see that we get nothing. So if you're getting a cannot get slash when running your server, you are doing this correctly. So last class, I separated all of our math logic that we're going to be doing in our calculator into a separate file, so that way the only thing that should be inside of our server.js file is our logic for running our server. So right now, I'm going to commit our code because we've gotten the most bare bones working of our server. So you can run git init, or you could use any sort of git GUI that you might have on your machine. But when you're inside of your directory, you can type git space init. It will initialize it. You can run git add and use the dot. Oh, hold on. Don't do that. Just hold on. rm rf git folder. There's one other file that we need to do when we put our files on GitHub, and we need to create a file that's called .gitignore. Hopefully this sounds pretty familiar for other classes that you know. Our node modules folder is pretty extensive. We've only installed 2 different things, and you can see all the different folders that are inside of it. That has even more folders and files, and it can get quite unmanageable. So we want to ignore this node modules folder. So we will create a gitignore folder, and we'll type in node modules into it. And now when we type in git init, we can run a git status, and this will show us everything that is either tracked or untracked inside of our Git repository. So you can see that we have a gitignore file, a package lock file, a package.json file, and server.js. Our node modules folder is not on that list. If you type in git status and it is, then you have incorrectly done your gitignore folder, or file, sorry. So now I can just type in git add period, git commit of message of init. And now I need to create my online, yep.
How do you do that gitignore file? Does your it's a folder, but did they?
It's not a folder, it's just a file. It's a file where its extension is gitignore, but there's no beginning part. So if you just right click, do new file, .gitignore. Sometimes for those of you that are on Windows, it can get a little bit harder to actually create a file with no beginning part. This is where you can use either Visual Studio Code or whatever text editor that you're using. Hopefully you can create it. If not, you're going to have to rely on your text or your terminal in order to create that file. Otherwise, it can get a little bit complicated for trying to create a file with no name. So I'm going to create my online repository. I'm going to call it COMP2068 Lab 2 Summer 2019 and Tuesday. And I can't remember if I said in this class or the other class, but I'll copy their pushing to an existing repository because I am not a robot and I don't know that off by heart. So I will make sure that period is not there. Add a remote branch, and then I can do git push u origin master. And if you're not sure how to do that, just always follow the basics that they have there on GitHub. It will make sure that you have your first bit a lot easier. So now inside of like our package JSON, we're done with it. We don't have to actually make any more changes to this. So you're welcome to just close it on your editor. So I'm just going to leave my editor full screen now, so that way you guys can see the most of my code. There's not really going to be any more commands that we're going to be running besides any sort of git pushes that we're going to be doing. So as you are updating your code, I always encourage you to just do a commit. You don't even always have to push up to GitHub. In fact, sometimes it's better to not push up to GitHub until you're done, but to do your commits locally, because as your commits are still local, it's a lot easier to make changes to them. Once you push it up to a remote branch, it gets a little bit more complicated. So it's usually best just keep it locally, do a commit, and then keep working. Is there anyone that's still copying down what's on my screen right now? No. Okay. So I'm going to create a math.js file. And this is where we're going to be handling all of our math that is inside of our application. So in order to import a file, we end up using what is called module.exports to export code from our main application. So if we type in module.exports, this will be passed some sort of code that we have in here. In this case, I'm going to create a variable called handle HTTP calculation. And this is going to be an anonymous function that's assigned. And then we pass it. So, as mentioned last week, the two main things that we deal with when we're working on a node server is we have this REQ and this RES. And REQ stands for request, and RES stands for response. I'm actually going to type out the full thing just so that it's a little bit easier. You can call these whatever you want, but request and response makes the most sense. So right now, I just want to make sure that my application is just working as expected. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to say response.send, and I'll say hello world. It's kind of the, you guys know, the go-to thing for testing that you did the bare minimum for your project. You can send hello world. So in this case, in our response, we want to send hello world. Now, in order to use this file, I'm just going to split this so that way hopefully you can still see it if you're doing something. We need to listen for our index page. When we went to our application on just the index, it says it cannot find, what was it? Cannot get slash. And that means that it doesn't know what to do when we're on our index page. So what we're going to do is we're going to tell our application what we have to do. So we're going to say app.get. So when we do a get request, and we give it a string of the path. So in this case, it's going to be the slash, which is our index route. And then we can give it a function. So as you saw in our math.js that's down here, we have this handle HTTP calculation. So we can actually import that into our file. So we have const, and I'm just going to copy paste this, handle HTTP calculation equals require, and then make sure that you use the period so that way it knows to do a relative path. We want to import our math file. So import math. And then you take this math that we're importing, our handle HTTP calculation, and we pass that as the second parameter on our function. So it's app.get slash, comma, handle HTTP calculation, or whatever you want to call it. That's a lot of characters. If you want, you can just call it do math or whatever you want. It doesn't really matter. You could call it banana. Again, as you guys know, you can call something whatever you want. It's not going to be the name of what we are exporting it as. It's just when we use module.exports, in this case, it's just whatever we want to call it. It's called a default export. So you can name it whatever you want. So if I save that and I go into my application and I refresh, you'll see that we now get hello world. So at the index of our application, use the handle HTTP calculation function from our math.js file to handle the request. So now that we've set up our server, we're listening at the index of our application, we're actually completely done with server.js. We don't need to do anything else in this file now. So once you have this working, you can just close it. So I'm going to take this time to do a git commit. So I'm going to say git add, let me finalizing our server.js import math. And I'll just push that up for if anyone needs to refer to it. Is everyone with us so far? Please put up your hand if you're not.
Can you just go back to the other file?
Yes. The math one?
Yeah.
Yep. I'll put them side by side just so that if anyone's using server.js. Ooh. There. So math.js is on top, server.js is down below. Okay. So when looking at the lab, you can see that it says right here that we need to having add, subtract, multiply, and divide as valid parameters of what is called method. So if I just copy paste this I need to edit because it says lab 3. It should just say nothing at all. So can I increase that as well? No. So right here you can see it says localhost 3000, and then we give it the query parameters of method, x, and y. Thanks for joining, Vlad. So right now we aren't doing anything with this. And if we look at here, we have a sample output of what it should look like. So we have our x, we have our y, and then we have the results. We have an equal symbol. We have a plus sign. Thanks, Vlad, again. So what would make the most sense is to kind of set up our template for what gets sent to the user. So what we're going to send to the user, and I'm going to use the backticks because we're going to be injecting variables into our string. So I'm going to put 16 plus 4 equals 20. Or what is the easiest way to think about it is our result, 4 is y, and so it's actually x plus y equals result. So if I save that and I refresh, it says x plus y equals result. And this is now where we can start handling our request that is coming in. So who wants to take a guess where we end up getting our method x and y from? Sorry?
URL?
Correct, but inside of our function here we have two objects. We have request and response. Correct. So as mentioned in last class, you can kind of think of request as everything that comes from the user. So what URL they're going to, what their query parameters are, anything like that that comes from the user, any information from them comes in request. And then anything that we want to send back to them is a part of our response object. So I already know where it is, but if you wanted to look it up, expressjs, they have documentation. I'm just going to go over this really quick just to show you. But you can go to their API reference, and we know that we're looking for query parameters. So I'm just going to type in query into here. I see something about query string, query parser, but right now I see that I'm still in the application part. What I really want to be in is request. I know that request is where everything coming from the user is. So in the left-hand side, I see req.query. So that sounds kind of like what I'm wanting. So you can see right here as an example, if we're on the search and we give it a queue of Toby Ferret, we can reference it using req.query.queue. So our request.query is where everything that is in the URL query parameters is going to live. So in here we can say const query equals request.query. And I'm also going to just send it so that way we can see it on the front end. Actually, hold on. I'm going to do that a little bit differently. I'm going to say response.json, our query, and just throw a comment, respond back with our query. Just so that way we can see it. And just for note, I did comment out the response.send. One thing that if you end up having two responses that come back, you'll sometimes get an error in your console saying that requests or response headers have already been sent and that you can't send them because you've already sent them. So in this case, I'm just doing response.json query so that way we can see what it looks like. So right now, if I refresh, you can see that we get our method, which is going to be add, x, which is 16, and y, which is 4. So I have a Chrome extension which automatically formats JSON in my browser. Chances are it might look a little bit more like this on your screen. But, sorry? Oh, hold on. It might not be anything because I have put in the query parameters here. So what I'm going to do is inside of Slack, in the Tuesday channel, I'm just going to paste in which URL that we're using. So you can just actually click this on your machine, and it will, this will be the same URL that I'm currently on. So I recommend you to do that on your machine. But you can see that we have our method add x of 16 and y of 14. But there's no way just from giving it a method that we know which calculation to do. So as mentioned, you can do add, subtract, divide, and multiply. But right now we're actually just using a string. So if we uncomment our response, and I'm just going to delete this response JSON, what we need to do is we need to have x, which is going to be query.x. We need our y, which is going to be query.y. And we need our method, which is going to be query.method. You could also just refer to it as just query dot. But one thing that we're going to be doing is trying to make this, I'm going to be cleaning this up as we go. So we can try to take something that's very verbose and try to just bring it a little bit easier to read, and hopefully a little bit less magic. Because you don't necessarily know what is inside of our query object just by looking at it without looking at this code right here. So in order to get our result, we're going to have to handle some sort of case of our method. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create another function that's going to be called handle operation, or actually handle calculation. And this is going to accept our method, our x, and y variables. So how would someone go about doing different things based off of the value of method? What would be your kind of knee-jerk reaction if you know that you have to handle something when method is add, subtract, multiply, and divide?
Yeah, switch or if else.
Yep. A switch case is probably the easiest to handle it, just because it's a little bit harder to manage. Whereas in this case, we're just going to use a switch case with our method, and we're also going to convert it into lowercase. So we're going to have 5 different cases that are totally valid. We're going to have add. We're going to have subtract. We're going to have multiply and divide. And then we're also going to have one last case, which is our default. And this is kind of like our else statement. So we're just, for divide, we're just going to say return. This is an invalid option. So right now, because of our cases falling through, no matter which string that we give it, it will always return back saying that it's an invalid option. Yep.
Can I have multiple strings for one case?
Multiple strings for one case.
Yeah, like if I want to have add and the plus sign.
Yeah, you could do that. So in this case, you would just do, like right now, all of these cases are doing the exact same thing. It falls through because we haven't done a return statement. So if I gave it add, it will still return this. So in this case, if you wanted to also do the plus symbol, you would just do it like that.
Yeah, but like, can I do this just inside one case so I
No,
don't have to?
unfortunately not. In that case, if you're wanting to do 2 different things, then you could do like an if statement. So you could say if method to lowercase equals to add or it's equal to the plus sign, you could do it then. But unfortunately, no. Sorry. Don't blame me, blame JavaScript. Actually, I don't know. Maybe there's a way to do it, but like I've never had to do it. I don't think that there is.
Comma? After add?
Sure. We'll give it a go. And just because it could be a syntax error, I'm just going to throw this all in a switch case that says catch, and apparently not.
Savage.
So we're just going to call our function right here. Down in our handle HTTP calculation, don't actually bother worrying about the try catch. You can just ignore that. We're just seeing if it works for Vlad. But we're going to get our result back from our handle calculation. But as you can see up above, we need to give it our method, our x, and our y variables to our handle calculation. And then it comes back with our result. And I'm going to respond back with our result. So let's see what happens, Vlad. Oh, if I refresh, it's an invalid option, even with the thing of add. Did that work?
You didn't blow up.
But it didn't work.
Yeah, but like, did you pass any value to this?
I did.
Can you show me where exactly?
Yeah, I passed method right here. So if I console log method, when I refresh, you can see method is add. So it should, in theory, hit this one and return back is
You
Vlad's.
should have a break though.
Sorry?
You should have a break in set case, no?
No. So when I'm returning, you actually don't have to do a break.
Break.
If I was assigning it to a variable, then I would have to break.
Can you console log the method dot lowercase? Like, just before the try maybe?
Yep, I could do console log method dot to lowercase. And it's still add. So clearly that did not work. But if I remove that, restart it, is Vlad smart? Apparently not. Nah, I'm just kidding, Vlad. No, that was a good question. So we can just get rid of that. So I'm going to just move add to the bottom just for right now, just because obviously doing addition is the easiest thing that you can do. It's the first thing that they teach you when you start doing math in school is addition, so that's where we'll start. So for addition, all we have to do is just take our x and y and add them together. So we can just return x plus y inside of our case, switch case. I'm just going to remove that. And we still have our result right there. So right now, we're giving it a value of 16 and 4. So if I refresh this, I get 164. Anyone want to tell me why?
So strings.
Yep. So how do we convert it into a number? Yes. So right here we have our x and our y. So we want to use parse int. And we want to use parse int. Okay. So now when we refresh, ooh, what are we getting there? Invalid status code. Oh, it's probably when we're using res.send right here, it's probably not liking it because it's thinking that we're using an actual status code, which who here knows what status codes are? One person, couple people. So status codes are pretty handy. They're ways that robots are able to know that a website is working or not working. Probably the most famous one that you guys know is 404. So when you go to a page and that doesn't exist, or maybe it's moved, or there's no real reason, you just went to it, it doesn't exist, that is a 404 status code. The most common one that you guys probably know but don't know is actually a 200. A 200 means that everything was successful. So you can see right here in our network tab, if we refresh, we get a status code of 200. Whereas before, if I sent just the result, I don't know if it'll actually allow us to send no. We get a 500 status code because 20 is not a valid status code. So let's just get rid of this res.send result. We only want to send the result in our preferred string. So we can use our x plus y equals result. And we can also now take our x and our y that we've taken out of our query. So we can say x here, y here. So x plus y equals result. And if that's hard to read, it's a $sign followed by the curly braces. So, and then anything that is in the curly brace, if it's anything that's valid in JavaScript is totally valid in there. You could create a function if you so wanted to, or do even more nested stuff. It's kind of interesting. So now when we refresh, we get 16 plus 4 is 20, and that's totally fine. If we said 16 plus 5 is 21, that's also good. But if I change the method to subtract, that's where it starts to fall short. So obviously 16, when you're trying to do subtraction, you wouldn't do a plus sign, and 16 minus 5 is also not 21. So inside of our switch case, we're just going to put in the rest of our cases. So a division is going to be x divided by y. Multiplication is going to be x multiplied by y. And then subtraction is going to be x minus y. So when we refresh now, if we do subtraction, that's the right result. But you can see right here that it still has the plus sign because we have that hard-coded in our string right now. So even if I did multiplication, so multiply, 16 times 5 is 80. If we did divide, I'm going to change it into a regular number. So 16 divided by 4 is 4. Does anyone have a suggestion of how we can figure out how to change this plus into the proper sign?
To sign specifically, or we can use text?
Sorry?
To the sign specifically, or
We are going to use the sign. Yeah.
Text would be easy.
Text would be easy. We could just like throw it in right here.
An object.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to do. So one method that you might think right off the bat is, let's just do another switch case. We just give it the method, it returns back what we're doing, but we already have a switch case that's already listening to our method. It handles our calculation, but what we could do is return an object that has both our operation value and our result value. So instead of returning just the value, I'm going to say result equals x minus y, and our operation is going to be the minus sign. So I'm going to do that with all of them. Multiply, divide, add. I'm also, instead of using the asterisk, I'm just going to use an X because typically more people know an X than the asterisk for multiplication. And just make sure if you're copy pasting that you also change your result values so that way you're not doing the same thing. But now this is going to, at least right now, without making any other changes outside of our switch case, this is going to have an issue with our handle calculation that we're running down below. Before we were returning only a value. Now we're returning a value, like an object that has both of our result and our operation in it. So if I were to refresh, we get object. So obviously that's not very helpful. We want to turn this into our result. So what you can do is you could say result.result, which is a little bit redundant, but it is totally valid. And you can also throw in our result.operation. So I'm just going to throw a comment, get our operation and result from handle calculation. So now if I refresh, we get 16 divided by 4 is 4. If I change it to add, we get a plus. If I change it to subtract, we get a minus. If I change it to multiply, we get an x. So very quickly, we've changed our application from changing it from just the result to an object that has both our operation and our result value. But it's not fully working. There are some things in our application. This is more what is called working on the success path. So right now when we give our application exactly what it is expecting, it will give us exactly what we want. But if for some reason we gave it, instead of giving a number for y, we gave it hello, it's going to say not a number because that's what parse int and parse float does when it's not a number value. As well as if you just didn't include it at all, same thing, still not a number. If we did the same thing with x, now it's going to be not a number times not a number equals not a number, which to me that sounds right. I mean, that sounds, two numbers multiply, or two not numbers multiplied by each other are probably not a number. But the same thing also has an issue if we don't give it a method. Now it can't read two lowercase. So now our application is just crashing. So we're going to do a couple things. We can check if something is not a number. So we're going to do an if statement right here in our handle HTTP calculation, which is going to say if is not a number. And please make sure when you're using is not a number that both ends are capitalized. So we're going to say if is not a number x, or we want to make sure or is not a number y. We want to return response.send, saying both x and y must be a number. So that's our error message. So right now, if I were to refresh this, let me just, so both x and y must be a number. So I can give it x equals 16 and y equals 4. And we get cannot read property of lowercase of undefined. So there's another thing that we can do. We can say if there is no method, we can return saying response.send method must be included. Refresh that. Method must be included. That sounds right to me. But what if I say and method equals fake? We still get undefined. So what we could do is similar to our rock, paper, scissors, we could say what our valid options are. So valid options is going to be a string of add, subtract, multiply, and divide. And we're just going to say if there's no method, or our valid options includes method dot to lowercase, and we want to say that it does not include and be one of the following. So here I can use that join on our array that we mentioned earlier. We can say valid options dot join and then a comma. So if I refresh now, it says method must be included, including add, subtract, multiply, divide. So we want to make sure that both x and y are numbers. Make sure that the method submitted is valid and there. And this is pretty much every other case. As mentioned, if you ended up doing a really large calculation, we will probably end up getting like infinity. So if I did let me just make this full screen for a sec. Multiply, and I'm going to do 999, 999, 999, 999, and do the same thing here. Maybe a little bit bigger. Come on. How big do I have to go? There we go. So we end up multiplying by infinity. I mean, that's still technically right. I mean, infinity is a little bit weird, right? Technically, there's an infinite amount of numbers between 2 and 3. You can always add another decimal point. But when you also multiply something by infinity, it's still infinity. So I wouldn't say that this is wrong, and I certainly would not take marks off if you submitted this. So we'll just keep that as is. But the one thing that I personally find is looking at the code that we have right now, like while it's all valid, it's a little bit messy. Like I don't like having result.result. That doesn't make sense. And maybe changing our calculation, so we could say calculation, and then it could be calculation.operation and calculation.result. But what's nice about JavaScript is we have the ability to do what's called destructuring. So in here, I can actually take out operation and result, and I can just reference those without doing anything. So I can just say operation and result is based on our handle calculation, and then just reference it here. And then the other thing that we could do is we can parse x and y and then do the exact same thing that we did down here with destructuring, and we can do that outside of our request.query. So I'm just going to do that. What I would usually do is I would probably do what's called a middleware, which would end up changing our query parameters beforehand, but we're not going to go over that today. So if I just did request.query.x equals parse int request.query.x, I'm going to do the same thing with y. So I'm just going to copy these comments onto it, x, y, and then I can remove this and say const x, y method equals request.query. So we end up taking our x, y, and method outside of request.query, and you'll see that everything, if we keep going over to Slack, if I refresh with something that is a little bit easier, so x equals 16 and y equals 4, it still works as expected. So that's on multiply, add, everything's still working. Is there any questions right now? Yep.
Instead of the parsing, shouldn't we be using number?
You can use number.
Or doesn't consider decimal.
Yeah, you could do that right now with because this is just like a simple calculator, we are just assuming that it's a integer. It could be a decimal value, and that's totally valid. You can do number. In fact, I use it all the time. And it will work the exact same. So if I refresh, it still says 20, but if I gave it 4.4, that also works. Whereas if we were using parseInt before, as mentioned, it wouldn't work with any of our decimal places. But just for testing purposes, oh, why did iTunes just open? Go away. Obviously testing some of our other things, like we obviously know 16 plus 4 is 20. We know 16 divided by 4 is 4. All of that's pretty simple math stuff that we covered in elementary school. But when we start obviously getting into decimal places, we can't necessarily verify that as easily. But if we know that our math is already working for regular integers, we can obviously assume that it's working for decimals. But yeah, good point. We can totally use number. It's a much, I'd say, more modern way of handling it. Previous, you would use parseInt. So if you're wanting to support like really old browsers, like I don't know if you're a big fan of like Netscape or IE6 or something, you could probably use parseInt. Whereas number will not work. Any other questions? No? So I'm just gonna push this up right now. So if I do another git add, git commit, handle different methods, return string of calculation. And I'll push that up. But you'll see that this is the lab. We just did this in about an hour. So as mentioned, please don't just copy the lab that we did in class here. I do encourage you to try to solve this. And if you want to solve it in a completely different way, like if you didn't like the way that I did it, you're more than welcome to try it in a different way. Instead of returning an object, you could do two different functions to get both the result and the operation. If you want to use number or parseInt, it doesn't really matter. And any error handling, you could also handle it in a totally different way. But what is pretty much will always be the same is our server.js. This is as I mentioned, this is the bare bones of our application. So with that being said, unless if you have any other questions that you either want to ask in class or just ask personally up at the front, you guys are welcome to go home. So,
Chris, can you open up the console? Like, what did you do so like you don't need to update your server, and then update your server every single time?
So inside of package, I'm going to talk into the computer for a second. So Vlad asked how we make it so that our server will always restart when we make a file change, right? So inside of our scripts is like our shortcuts on Windows. So we have one shortcut that's called start, which runs node server.js. And then we have dev, which runs nodemon server.js. So when we start our application, we type in npm run and then our shortcut. So in this case, we type in dev and it automatically listens for us. You can also just run npm run start, and this will run our application normally where you have to restart the server. Sorry?
Oh, npm run.
Yes, npm run dev. Hi, just one sec.